For decades, people who want to end their life with the help of a doctor and who have the means to do so have travelled to a handful of countries, most commonly Switzerland, for euthanasia. But gradually, more countries around the world have begun to permit some form of medically assisted dying. Politicians in a number of others, including Ireland and France, are now seriously debating it. Canada, where medically assisted dying became legal in 2016, decided to extend eligibility to people whose sole reason for ending their life is mental illness. But the planned expansion, already twice delayed, is deeply controversial. In this episode, we speak to a leading psychiatrist about the situation in Canada and why he's a vocal opponent of the expansion. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. To help me introduce our story today, I'm speaking with Patricia Nicholson, health and medicine editor at The Conversation in Canada. Hey, Patricia.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Patricia, Canada is one of a small group of countries and some states within the US and Australia that now allow people to seek help in dying from medical professionals. And now a number of other countries around the world are grappling with whether to introduce laws around this too, around euthanasia in some form. Tell me what it's like in Canada, how the law works right now, and what steps someone has to go through to get help in ending their life.
Well, medical assistance in dying, which is abbreviated to MAID, it became legal in Canada in 2016. Now, originally at that time, it was only available to people who were nearing the end of their natural life or who had a terminal illness. But in 2019, a Supreme Court case removed that requirement, and it's now available to people whose illness or disability is not necessarily fatal, but is incurable and causes unbearable suffering. The words in the legislation are grievous and irremediable. So that is the bar for MAID. And the process differs a bit from province to province, but people seeking MAID can request it through their healthcare provider, or there are MAID referral services that can be accessed by phone to start the process. The request needs to be made in writing, and it needs to be witnessed. Then you need to be assessed by two different healthcare providers. That ensures that you've been fully informed of all the other treatment options that might be available, including palliative care.
Are there any other safeguards in place as well?
Yes, you need to give final consent at the time of the procedure, and there are some additional safeguards for people whose condition isn't terminal.
So this has been in place now in Canada for 8 years, and there are, as you say, different expansions that have happened in that period. Do we know about who is accessing medical assistance in dying?
Yes, we do have stats on that. MAID use has grown a lot since it first became available. There are about just over 1,000 assisted deaths in 2016. And as of 2022, there were more than 13,000 people accessing MAID, which accounts for about 4% of all deaths in Canada.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely being used. In terms of who's choosing MAID, it's a fairly even split between men and women. In 2022, the average age was 77. And by far the most common condition associated with MAID requests is cancer. That's well over 60% of MAID users in every year that it's been available. Most people who choose MAID do so when they are nearing the end of their natural life. So MAID deaths in people whose natural death wasn't on the foreseeable horizon have accounted for a very small percentage of cases. In 2022, it was about 3.5%. However, that number was a lot bigger than it had been the year before, so that too is growing.
And importantly, under the current law, people whose only underlying condition is mental illness are not currently allowed to access MAID, are they?
As it stands now, that's correct. Legislation to expand MAID to include people suffering solely from mental illness that was originally supposed to take effect a year ago in March 2023, but it has been highly controversial. And it was pushed back a year to March 2024. But then just weeks before it was supposed to come into force, it was postponed once again, this time until at least 2027.
And why has it been so controversial?
Well, one of the key arguments in support of expanding MAID eligibility is that excluding mental illness negates the very real suffering of people who have those conditions and infringes on their autonomy. But those who have reservations about expansion argue that it is much more difficult to predict the course of mental illness than it is for a lot of physical illnesses, which makes it very difficult to know whether that condition is in fact irremediable. So it may not meet that bar of having an irremediable illness. The other issue that sometimes gets attention is access to mental health care, which people can find difficult, and in many places there are wait lists for the kind of care that they need. And no one wants to create a system in which it's easier to access MAID than it is to access mental health care.
One of the vocal opponents of offering MAID for mental illness is someone that you've worked with quite a bit, a doctor called Sonu Gaind. Can you tell me about Sonu?
Sonu's a great person to talk to about this topic. He's a psychiatrist who teaches at the University of Toronto, and he's also psychiatrist-in-chief at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre here in Toronto. He approached me about MAID in 2021 when the expansion of eligibility to mental illness was first added to the proposed legislation. I've worked with him on several stories exploring ethical considerations around MAID, and in particular MAID for mental illness.
To be honest with you, it's an area that I never actually anticipated getting involved in when I started working because it was not on the horizon. At that time, there were no assisted dying laws in Canada, and all of that changed actually quite recently and in a relatively short time frame.
Sonu Gaind has been at the forefront of grappling with these changes. When assisted dying became legal in Canada in 2016, Sonu became chair of the medically assisted dying team at Toronto's Humber River Hospital.
I'm a psychiatrist, but within that, the subspecialty area is cancer and psychiatry. So I have worked with patients who have been living and dying with cancer my whole career, and their families.
Part of his role was establishing hospital policies that conformed with the new legal requirements.
The other part was an oversight role of the clinical cases that were applying for assisted dying, because this was all new for everyone.
So it must have been quite a difficult job in those early days to understand what the rules were and then what your roles were as doctors in this very fast shifting environment.
It was a shifting environment, and this is why we had such kind of meticulous thoughtfulness put to how we would be proceeding as a team, kind of in a mindful way, and trying to adjust to these new policies, and also trying to understand what is it that is leading people in some of these situations to seek death. And that was also in itself quite eye-opening because it's a different thing for different people.
But in mid-2022, when the Canadian government announced that it would expand MAID to people whose sole reason for ending their life was mental illness, Sonu told his superiors that when that happened, he would resign his role as chair of the MAID panel at Humber River Hospital.
Although I'm not what's called a conscientious objector, meaning if somebody objects to the concept of assisted dying, they don't have to be involved. I'm not a conscientious objector. If I was, I would have never chaired my former hospitals team. Because I did believe that there were some circumstances which we could compassionately offer this pathway for people to avoid a painful death. That's how the law originally came in. However, what subsequently happened in terms of the expansion of policies I was not comfortable with, I had concerns about what some people would be seeking death for in situations like that, felt I could no longer participate.
Sonu has since moved to another hospital in Toronto called Sunnybrook for completely unrelated reasons, he stresses. But he's continued to be a vocal critic of the government's decision to expand medically assisted dying for psychiatric illnesses.
And what I have unfortunately come to experience and very firmly believe over time is that while our initial laws that came in were done for reasons which I think most Canadians agree with, which is to help provide somebody compassionate relief from end-of-life suffering or suffering that they are not going to be otherwise able to get any relief from, what's driven the expansions is something very different. And it's led to a situation where people are able to get MAID fueled by all sorts of life suffering. And we're seeing this, including things like poverty, including things like lack of access to care. And it no longer is the illness suffering that's necessarily driving the MAID request for some people, and that's allowable under our current laws.
Can you tell me why, for you personally, there's a difference between somebody with a physical illness seeking to end their life and somebody with a mental illness?
I'll say that I think the people who've been pushing expansions here have not asked that question. They've pretended the question doesn't exist because they've started from the premise that it would be discrimination if MAID for sole mental illness was not provided when it is provided for other medical conditions. And what they've completely bypassed is whether there are legitimate and significant differences that warrant those situations and conditions being treated differently. Mental illnesses and psychological suffering, those are every bit as significant, serious, and legitimate as any other physical or medical conditions. It's not a question of one being dismissed, marginalized, or ignored. It's not that. The suffering is real, but the differences are also real. One is the entire premise of assisted dying laws in Canada, and frankly, of pretty well every place I'm aware of in the world that has assisted dying laws, is that the person is getting it for a medical condition that will not improve. In other words, a medical condition that is irremediable. What that means is we need to be able to assess and predict for each patient whether or not they will get better from their medical condition. And unlike things like cancer, unlike all sorts of other medical conditions where, especially when they're at an advanced stage, their outcome is far more predictable. For mental illnesses, all of the evidence across the world shows us we simply cannot make those predictions with any honesty.
Sonu pointed to research into psychiatric euthanasia by a Belgian-based psychiatrist called Marie Nicolini. One of her studies looked at how accurately doctors can predict the long-term chances of recovery in a patient with treatment-resistant depression.
And the odds of being right were 47%. That's actually worse than flipping a coin. So think about what that means when the white lab coat walks into the room of somebody who's suffering from depression, whose depressive symptoms themselves change how the person thinks. Because cognitively, we know there are changes associated with depression, including leading to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, a sense of feeling lack of self-worth and feeling that I am terrible, and a sense that the future will be terrible and nothing can help. And in that situation, a white lab coat walks in and says, oh yes, I agree with you. You will not get better. This condition is irremediable. And they're going to be wrong most of the time. What that's actually then doing is having that white lab coat become complicit with the symptoms of the illness in a way that actually is a false premise. Because we're telling the person their mental illness will not get better. And as I said, we will be wrong over half the time.
To Sonu, there's another false premise being used by those who want to push expansion of assisted dying for sole mental illness in Canada. It's about suicidal thinking.
This is the idea that when people are applying for psychiatric euthanasia, that we can somehow separate that and their motivations for that from suicidality that is fueled by the mental illness. So again, you asked for differences. Here's another key difference. Mental illnesses are the only conditions that suicidality can actually be a part of the symptoms of the illness itself.
So if somebody with severe mental illness requests assistance in ending their life, Sonu says it's very difficult for a doctor to assess whether their desire to die is actually caused by their mental health condition or not.
What the evidence shows us is that we don't know how to separate that sort of suicidality fueled by mental illness, which can respond to suicide prevention techniques, and the person regains the will to live. We don't know how to separate that suicidality from other motivations leading to requests for psychiatric euthanasia. And when we wrongly tell society we're filtering out suicidality. All of that actually, unfortunately, risks in particular marginalized populations. And sadly, we know that people with mental illness also have disproportionately higher rates of social suffering, like loneliness, like poverty, housing and food insecurity. And we are seeing some Canadians driven to MAID fueled by those kinds of circumstances.
It's been said that MAID, that medically assisted dying, is not suicide by some. What would you say to that point? And what are the current debates in Canada about using the word suicide as it relates to seeking help with death?
So the people who argue that MAID is not suicide, they're actually falsely conflating evidence in ways that are not conveying the reality for mental illnesses. Because when you look at populations that get MAID for end-of-life conditions, then you can actually see a difference between those populations and traditionally suicidal populations. And what you actually find is that people who get MAID when end of life is foreseeable, they tend to come from higher socioeconomic standings. They tend to have higher levels of education. In terms of any of the demographic profiling that's done, they also are more likely to be having a background that is white.
A few other countries, including Belgium, the Netherlands and Switzerland, do allow psychiatric euthanasia. And Sonu says looking at data from these places shows a difference in the type of people seeking to end their life.
Once you expand it beyond end-of-life conditions and look at people getting it for psychiatric conditions, you then find that people actually have unresolved psychosocial suffering, like loneliness and poverty. You find that they are from the more marginalized communities. And you also find something that we know from the suicide literature that links a lot of this together. Marginalization, wishes for death, whether people get better or not. And that is that for psychiatric euthanasia, you find a very troubling 2-to-1 gender gap emerge of twice as many women as men getting psychiatric MAID. That from the European data, 70% of people getting psychiatric euthanasia are women. 30% are men, and they have unresolved psychosocial suffering. And again, that 2-to-1 ratio is particularly troubling because it also parallels the 2-to-1 ratio of women to men who attempt suicide when they are mentally ill. And most of them do not complete suicide, and most of them do not try a second time. In other words, when mentally ill, twice as many women as men attempt suicide but do not die by suicide, and do not even try a second time. They regain the will to live over time.
Sonu says that a gender gap has also emerged in Canada since medically assisted dying was extended to people where death was not reasonably foreseeable in 2021. This is known as Track 2.
So there are more women than men getting MAID for Track 2. There are also more women than men getting MAID for what people have described as the more vague conditions. One of the largest growing categories is other. That actually now accounts for 15%, I believe, of our MAID deaths. So it's less specific. And for other conditions and combined conditions like chronic pain with other conditions, again, more women than men get it.
Hi, I'm Katie Riley. On the Slow Newscast from Tortoise, Donald Trump became the first former U.S. president in history to face a criminal trial.
The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records.
This is not a trial. This is not an act of criminality.
We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct.
This is the story of his first week in court, told through the transcripts. Listen now to the Slow Newscast wherever you get your podcasts.
Ottawa has delayed expanding MAID a second time. The federal health minister says new legislation will lay out a revised timeline.
In February, when the Canadian government announced that it was delaying the expansion of MAID for sole mental illness until at least 2027, Sonu was relieved, but he was also astonished.
I hope your listeners think about what this means for a country twice to have very public and significant policy changes that they're planning for, and twice at the brink of those to very publicly step back and reverse those. I know of no other policy, in Canada at least, that this has happened to with the same government as well twice. It's not that there was a change in government. It's unprecedented, but I believe the reason it's happened is because of the inadequate processes that were followed to lead to this policy in the first place, and the ideologically fueled expansion that has pushed it.
I mean, there are clearly people who are upset about the delays. There are people who've come forward and said they'd been hoping it could be their way out of what for them is real misery, and spoken in the media about it. What would you say to them? Because it's, you know, it's their lives, it's their experience.
Yeah, and this is part of, I think, what has unfortunately happened is that this whole discussion and debate about dying, it sucked all the oxygen out of the room to focus on, well, death is the only solution in these situations, without then honestly saying, would we be providing death for the real reasons we say we're providing it? That's all the stuff I talked about before, about providing it for an illness that we know won't get better. For mental illnesses, you can't say that. And are you filtering out suicidality and marginalization? Again, for mental illnesses, we can't do that. But then the second piece is, before we get to saying that, well, death is the only way we can compassionately help you, because that is how it's been framed for some people, and that troubles me, because it actually sends a very strong message that there's nothing else we can do. And we have not focused nearly enough on how we help people live with dignity. And I think that what I hope comes from this debate is that with the awareness of the real suffering that people with mental illness and other social situations are struggling with, that we as a society think, well, maybe there are other ways we can help them. Let's ensure they actually have access to the care they need. Things like psychotherapy, social support, a lot of suicide prevention. Less than 1 in 3 Canadians with mental health needs get the care and support they need. The Mental Health Commission tells us that. For adolescents and youth, it's even worse, less than 1 in 4. And so we aren't giving people proper access to the medical and psychiatric care they need.
Sonu is particularly worried about the most marginalised people in society who may fall fastest through these gaps and decide to seek medical help in ending their life.
Again, looking at the evidence, we know that any sort of marginalisation fuels suicide. And this is in every country. It's not just Canada. So any country that has a First Nations or Indigenous population, for example, suicide rates tend to be anywhere from 2 to 9 times higher than non-Indigenous rates, depending on which population. For LGBTQ two-spirited people, again, it's anywhere up to 4 times higher, 1.5 to 4 times higher. And so if we as a society are ignoring these other drivers of what some more disenfranchised people seek death for, and we provide it as a societal function, I don't know what that says about us. And so this is why I actually do feel that in terms of the expansions, the part that's particularly disturbed me is that I do feel that they come from a perspective of privilege. I myself would have more autonomy with any sorts of expansions. I'm not willing to pay that price because I know that the homeless person across the street from me, if we expand too much, may be provided state-sanctioned death for reasons I'm absolutely not comfortable with.
Well, thank you, Sonu. It's been a really enlightening conversation and an important one, so we appreciate your time and explaining the issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much once again for actually bringing this to attention and for exploring the complex issues involved on a difficult topic.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Patricia Nicholson at The Conversation in Canada, who you heard at the top of the show. We'll pop links to a couple of stories she's run on the assisted dying debate in Canada in our show notes, including some by Sonu Gaind. This episode was written by me, Gemma Ware, and produced by Men Marawani and Katie Flood. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and Sarai Nandi does our transcripts. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do go sign up for the Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really does help us reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.